Before I try to plug us back in where we were last talking and taping about such things as subjective, that is, individual talk being a kind of potential operational defense for the burgeoning intellect, and about how things might, when they're not being what they are, be in their better, if not ideal state. I thought we'd give the illusion of starting off on something different for a second. Let me ask you a question to think about it rhetorically. Consider that in ordinary life, professional thinkers, academic thinkers, and people who just happen to win the position on a quiz show, and ordinary people using other terminology, safe to say, life itself, thinking humanity, seems to have been involved and continues to be involved in what at first might appear to be the grandest of investigations, a supreme kind of questioning. The questioning being, what is the meaning of life? I'm going to see if some of you very quickly cannot see that instead of this being a weighty, comprehensive, meaningful inquiry, it is indeed the simpler of other possibilities. But now thinking about it a second, since this is not, sad to say, which is why all you guys are not yourselves new Old Testament prophets and famous people, since there is no real ready opposition to this, and since this obviously sees no opposition in life, don't look at it as being a new kind of fault-finding expedition, but consider just on the surface of it, with no great analyzation, with no internal argument any further, it would seem to be the philosophical, the intellectual, the worthwhile comment insofar as what might be the intellectual interest that a thinking person should have. What is the meaning of life? It's a trick. I'll grant you it's a trick that would dazzle a blind man once you see it. It is based upon this, though. It is going to lead to some verbal conclusion. Not just individually, it can individually, but it periodically seems to produce some sort of verbal / intellectual conclusion over large segments of humanity. It comes out as religious movements, factions within the religious movement, changes in political systems. One guy, a bricklayer, is not a philosopher. It is represented by him one day getting up and looking at his wife and his children and thinking, forget it. And he leaves and runs off with a waitress down the street. And he tries to enroll in thespian class until they find out that he is an undercover, I started to say heterosexual, but I didn't want to offend any of the heterosexuals. I mean thespians. I mean bricklayers is who I was really worried about. I can fight off any attack by thespians and heterosexuals, but some bricklayers I just don't have time to fool with. Back to the subject. All such approaches, such as what is the meaning of life, whether it's done religiously, whether it's done operationally, almost non-verbally by a person wanting to change their life, always like this, like everybody is. Everybody with a wild duck in their pants, if not in their brain. All of this is going to lead to some sort of verbal conclusion, parentheses S, series of conclusions. But there seems to be a continuing process of way stations of people coming to some sort of conclusion. Now, such conclusions arise from a premised assumption that the person making a conclusion, that is, the intellect, can in some way fathom what life's intention is through man. Now, it comes out in such ways, more common again, just like I'm going to example religion to death someday. But religion, an easy one that everybody has some exposure to. When it comes to the kind of verbal conclusion, such examples would be, what is the meaning of life? It could come out in such ways as someone saying, a particular person somewhere is saying and thinking, that God will ultimately reward a life spent as a good Christian or a good Muslim. That is, what is the meaning of life? The answer is to be a good Christian or a good Jew. There's the meaning of life. It is still based upon the premise that someone somewhere, some human, the intellect making the assumption, the intellect taking on the assumption, that the intellect is worthy of a decision, a premise, as to what life had in mind, which becomes very circular if I was trying to argue with an ordinary intellect, because they would say, well, yeah, that's the whole point. But look at the source of the information. Without it being an attack on religion, for you people out there on tape, you new people. The rest of you know it's not. It is simply one of the forms in which such energy gets into man. But consider, it's normally the answers to the meaning of life. These premises normally come about through revealed scriptures. You know, that is, the guides left these documents, and are some combination of prophetic voices. Prophets speak and say, well, the guides talk to me. Now, you people just daydream and you wander around, I know you people, which is not, of course, listed, but I know one of the things that Ezekiel or Daniel, it was one of them that he pointed out to some of them that the rest of the people, even the guys hanging around the temple, he knew, you know, you're wandering around wondering what's going to be in the next swimsuit issue next year. You know, you think that's the guides talking to you. Just, you know, it's the ducks in your pants. The guides speak to me, I'm too busy for that stuff. And so it comes out either as literally them saying, well, here is the word of God, the gods left it here written on these stones, or the gods talked to somebody and we passed it along. You then have a basis in ordinary life for coming to some conclusion as to what is the meaning of life. In fact, it seems rather simple. All you've got to do is come to your senses, be alert, do the right thing, and you find out that, hey, you don't have to worry about what to do in life or what the meaning of life is. The gods have already told us. The people that made us and life have told us what it is. It's over there in that building. It's over there in those books. It would seem to be the weightiest, the all-inclusive, as far as verbally goes. Think about it before I slip it to you, before we try and hide the pickle. You would think, well, that about covers it. What could be a greater, more profound inquiry than to what is the meaning of life? Surely some of you in the operation of the human brain by now can see some of the, when I say faulty operations of this, simply on the basis that there's more going on than you normally think about, which is the only thing that makes it faulty. From its ordinary level, it's working just fine. Thank you. I'm saying thank you for it, since it's not here to receive its award tonight. But it wants to thank you for going ahead and thinking that such questions are indeed important and probably the supreme question. A new kind of intellect, a neural subversive, would be pursuing another course of inquiry. Not what is the meaning of life, but the inquiry, as nonverbal as it is, you know I'm about to jump in anyway. Rather than what is the meaning of life, the inquiry would be more, how about more better? We got people that hear this from Alabama and Tennessee, and they won't know. A more better way of putting it would be not what is the meaning of life, but how is the meaning of life? And if that sounds even too crude for you, this is even cruder. You may think it sounds more enlightening. But a cruder version would be, how does life operate? How does life work? Now it's got to be this, in a non-local, a non-individual way. Because everybody asks how life works from a personal view, from an intellectually egocentric view. In fact, that's all the ordinary question of what is the meaning of life. People are not asking what is the meaning of life. Now, a man trying to congeal, if not forward his reputation in philosophical circles in the world of academia, he may write a paper or write a book on the basis, but all he's doing is playing with secondary affairs, rehashing, replowing, beating up on other dead philosophers. But people, ordinary people, do not actually ask what is the meaning of life. What they're really asking is, what's the meaning of life for me? Because they don't care about the meaning of life for anybody else. You should know that by now. There's no cynicism regarding the nature of life. But at the ordinary level, other than some passing, fairly fragile connections you may have with family and kin and friends, as far as the meaning of life, you don't care what the meaning of life is for anybody else. No, you can shed a tear while jogging. It's a passing thing. The meaning of life, people are not concerned like, what is the meaning of life for us? What is the meaning of life for all of us? The downtrodden, the uptrodden, the good, the bad, the ugly, politicians even. What's the meaning of life for all of us? Nobody cares. They're not wired up to care. They can say they do, but they don't. You should know that. The information is right there in your own genes. When they say, what's the meaning of life, they're saying, what's the meaning of life for the big guy? For me. All right, when I say that the revolutionist course would be really on the basis of how is the meaning of life, which maybe I'll try and deal with that in a second, and the cruder version is how does life work, and you got to put in here a comma or parentheses, how does life work in a non-personal manner, which you're getting closer to an attempted universal study. Man the species, and if you get really good, life the species, not the individual. Of course, most people just dealing with this life as a species. You got probably 60 or 70 years worth of material to deal with. But it's dealing on the basis that my intellect in the center, not in some psychological, not in some sham show of humility manner, but not with my intellect, not with me in the middle of it. Because if you do that, you're back to attempting to study man the individual. And it's useless. But to study man the species, you are really asking, how does life work? But you understand, this is getting to the area that ordinary people simply dream of as actually being objective. That is, you would have to be concerned, interested. How does life work? And not give a damn. That's what objective is. They just don't like to put it that way in the halls of Ivy and even over in the halls of Arsenia. They don't like to do that. But that would be truly objective inquiry. It's to, like to ask of life, to ask of anybody, to ask any question about, hey, how does this work? And not give one big old, I'll stick with damn. I got better ones, but they won't show them on cable TV if you guys keep trying to use it. But you've got to not care, literally, not figuratively, no, not a little bit, not comparatively speaking, not relatively speaking. Of course, you do the best you can. But to really ask, what is the meaning of life, for instance, rather than me using that as a springboard of something that a person doing this should transcend, I could use that. Except you would have to ask, what is the meaning of life, and not care whatsoever. And you can't do that. Because the ordinary intellect is based in such a way, the wiring system, the chemical and electrical operations of the human nervous system under the weight of 3D reality, cannot ask a question without having a premise. You just can't. You can't do it verbally. You can't trick yourself. You can't stay on your head. There are no forms of drugs that you can take that are worthwhile that will even momentarily make you be able to think, talk, without a premise. And as long as you got a premise, you got a preference. It's built in. There's no way out. You can't figure your way out. You can't logic your way out. You can't smart your way out. There is no way out because there's no way in. You were born there. That is the nature of the human nervous system. You have not stepped in a trap from which I or someone else can extract you. Unless you call being alive a trap, and if you do, then you don't need this because there is a real quick method out of this. You would have to ask if we were using the basic one of what is the meaning of life, but you would from every little molecule, from every little submolecule, for those of you that didn't know you had them. I'm just trying to cover it all. Way down to little submolecules. To really ask what is the meaning of life, and to use that down to the point of submolecules, you would have to not care. Not care. No matter how it came out, no matter how it appeared to be coming out. As soon as you were able to ask the question, or maybe you stood up on a little box, and you thought, well, I've never looked in that direction. Maybe this is where it's going. Maybe that is where it's going, and I've never even seen that area before, and I don't like it. Well, you're done for. Or if you do stand and go, wow, you're done for. Or even if you stand up and you think, well, I can't even see where it goes. It's all foggy, it's hazy. But by standing up, I can see 100 yards further than I could before. And I don't particularly like the looks of the lay of the land already. I mean, if this is any indication of what's ahead, then I don't know. Well, you're done for. You are left with dealing with the real question. What's the meaning of life? How about a little aside before I really get on it? How about the kind of questions that the intellect, since some of you are getting a little hopped up and wired up tonight already, how about the kind of questions that the human intellect doesn't like at all? And even parts that may seem to be a little bit of a new intellect in you, if you'll notice. Some of you don't like this. Even when you're somewhere, let's say, it's not completely above the ordinary level, at least maybe you've taken some sort of radical shift out to the side a little bit. If you'll notice, though, some of your feathers still tend to go ruffle, ruffle, ruffle. But who cares? I mean, if you care, you're done for, right? Didn't I just hear that? I was going to point out something that as much as in all kinds of ways you could safely say that I discourage being angry, being critical, that if you're attempting to do this. You people on tape, if some way you turn me on instead of accidentally Robert Schuller or something, ignore all this. You can ignore the whole tape, but especially ignore this kind of stuff, all right? Because it doesn't mean anything. There's no point to it, so don't get all involved. Especially don't turn to somebody sitting next to you and say, hey, Martha, that's the kind of stuff I believe in. Leave him on. Don't leave me on. Or if you turn to somebody next to you and say, hey, Fernando, that guy's crazy. That's the kind of crap that I've told you that people turn me off, all right? As much as I would seem to have indirectly, directly hinted, joked about, that if you're going to try and pursue stuff like this, you can't be hostile. You cannot be critical of life. You can't be angry, and etc. That is, you cannot be playing along with what I sometimes refer to as the force, being one of the dimensions, one of the forces driving three-dimensional life. What does it matter whether you do that or not, since life has got to, I've also pointed out, as many times as much as I discourage you from being hostile, but I've also pointed out, many of you can see already, it's just before your eyes constantly, life has got to have all three dimensions, all three forces. Life has got to have constantly, at every second, that which appears to ordinary intelligence to be what I used to call the C force, relatively speaking, the constructive force, the good force, just to use ordinary terminology. And then it's got to have what appears to be the D force, the destructive force, the evil in life. And then there is the normally tertium quid, the unrecognized third force, I was just calling E, the irrelevant force, the background, that which seems to be the plate upon which the first two are served, and etc. That being the case, and it is the case, if that being the case, then what difference does it matter whether you seem to be contributing to D? For one thing, we got to have D. I mean, what if you took me and what I said as some way as an attempted, some kind of terrestrial message to all of mankind is everybody stop being hostile. And what if for some reason a glitch got in the operations of this planet and a whole lot of people, wouldn't even take everybody, but a whole lot of people went, Jesus, I'd heard that kind of stuff and thought it, but now that he says it, I realize that I'm going to stop. And they did stop. Whew. God almighty. Somebody'd run me out of the universe. Once life came back to its senses and realized what it was, I'd be in for a terrible time. Of course, life wouldn't have to do it because I'll tell you the truth. Believe it or not, I'd feel guilty. I'd feel bad. Not guilty in the ordinary sense, but guilty in the sense that I'd see suddenly everything was about to blow up and I'd realize I did it. And worse than that, I can't get out of it. You know, I can't leave it. I guess that kind of hard-hearted attitude, perhaps some of us could have been ministers after all. But at any rate, what difference does it make? Since life has got to have anger, hostility, criticism, it's got to have it. So what difference does it make me telling you is you shouldn't do it, or that you can't do it and do this? Or to begin with, large numbers of people can't hearken to that. Why does it even matter whether you do or not? It is a part of life. It is a part of everyday basic existence as much as you breathing and your blood circulating. It is. There has got to be what you think of, or what ordinary intelligence thinks of right this second, is all forms of hostility. As much as you don't want any part of it, neither do I want to live next to it, but the killings, the assaults, all forms that are normally referred to, not just by religious people, but by decent, believing humans. All of the evil, moral, legal, all the despicable acts going on now, and all of just the kind of shoddy acts. But all of that going on right this second is necessary. It's not open to debate. It's not my opinion. It is necessary. It's just open to blindness that people cannot realize it. So it's got to go on. It is as much a support of life as the laws of gravity, the photosynthesis process on this planet, anything else. So if that be true, where do I get off? Where would anybody get off saying, hey, don't do that? You know, what if that spread? Of course, I'm taking this outside of all sorts of areas. Why would life have somebody? Why would life tell somebody to tell somebody else, don't be hostile? Because everybody's got a little bit of it. Everybody plays with all three of the dimensions. Everybody contributes a little something to all three forces. Some of you run numbers for the Gambinos one day, and the next day you're out pimping for prostitutes with the Lambuzzi family. You work for all three forces here and there. So what difference does it make? And what if what I said or somebody said, I'm not the only one that's ever said it, of course, but if I said it in such a context that it would begin to spread, it would be bad. Truly bad, not relatively bad. You'd have D-force now magnified, expanded, multidimensional. You would have five-dimensional earthquakes and floods and etc. The fabric of our reality would begin to fall apart. So why? What's the purpose in life telling a few people don't do that? It's got to have it. At a very small level you could see, I'm not going to stay much longer if you can't hear it, it's just a little form of suicide. Of course, here we are again in the three-dimensional world. There is no partial suicide. But that's what it amounts to. It is doing, in a sense, little bitty pieces here and there, taking little bitty actions that are not, over a wider area, self-preserving. So why does it do it? Why do you hear it? Some of you can go, that's a fact. That's a fact. When you're going against, in a wider sense, in a general sense, you're going against, if right then, let's say that you are really, instead of just fooling around saying that you play in all three of the dimensions like everybody does more or less, but let's say that you are normally pretty much of a, how should we put it, just kind of a pain in the ass. You know, that's the way you were when you were born. That's the way you were before you got involved with me, before I ever saw you. None of us take any responsibility. You're just kind of a hostile, arrogant, smart ass. You know, like some of you are, that just hardly anybody that liked you. You're just irritating, mad. The hermits won't even let you come to their convention. And in some way, I or somebody involved in this kind of stuff said, you can't do that. Not just you, as they said it. You can't do that and pursue this. And you went, and for some reason it just struck your little gray cells and they went, no, that's true, I can't. Life has lost a piece of some necessary action going on. It has lost a little foot soldier. What good is that doing life? Another way to put it, from relatively speaking at least, what would appear to be more of a personal view, what good does it do you? Because it is going on anyway. It's not as though the difference between me saying this or somebody involved in this kind of activity saying don't be hostile if you're going to try to do this, the difference between that and all the religions, I mean, I didn't make this, it's not the first time this kind of message has been made. Every religion on this planet right now, and somebody's standing somewhere saying, don't hate your neighbor, don't fight, don't kill. They've been saying that as long as they've been saying anything. So what's the difference? Why should you care? I don't mean theoretically or religiously or philosophically, but operationally, what difference should it make or could it make for you to try and stop being hostile when, at least theoretically speaking, 33 1/3% of all humans right now and at any given time, that 33 1/3% of all the energy running humanity is what you would consider to be hostile, anger, hatred. It's not going to change. It's not supposed to change. What difference does it make for you not to do it when it is as normal as the sun rising and setting? If indeed they ever do figure back out that they had it right the first time. I have it on good authority that Copernicus was a communist anyway. Before I go back to picking up where we were last taping, I could point out, of course, so that I don't just leave you any possible form of irritation, that a real revolutionist I suggest ends up with aims that are not necessarily those that could be verbally paralleled, much less compared to lives. Does not mean they're in conflict, but they certainly, I suggest, may not be comparable. And now that I've suggested that, I'll go beyond the suggestion and tell you this. They shouldn't be. That is, don't compare them. Go, well, I'm doing this for, and then there's a blank. Don't ever fill in that damn blank. Well, I'm doing this, blank, to help people. Well, I'm doing this to be a better person. Oh, damn. Don't fill in the blank. The blank is waiting there. The blank is the final trap that the original premise that may smell like good cheese or lasagna or Haagen-Dazs, whatever, rips your circuits. And that's the premise. And after that, instead of there being a big old bear trap, instead of a bear trap, what you have is a place, it's this long line, going this way if you're reading, and under it, at least in parentheses, it says, fill in the blank. It's just one of the minor variations of what is the meaning of life. And that is built into the human nervous system, not to read what is the meaning of life, question mark, boom. The question, that is, this energy that comes out as a question, is already wired into the human nervous system, so that the full thing is, what is the meaning of life, question mark, and don't anybody that majored in English write me, but then it has to be something like an additional comma, because it's not the end of the sentence. And then a blank. Because the question presupposes that you're going to have an answer. Now, an ordinary person might hear this. I don't know why they'd be listening, but they might hear it and say, well, wait a minute, I've thought about such things, and I know that philosophers and people ask the question, what's the meaning of life? But I'm not prepared for that. I don't have the education, the background, and so I've thought about it, but I tell you the truth. I haven't read any more about it. I haven't tried to read philosophy. I hadn't really tried to think about it because I don't think I can come up with it. No. They're wrong. They came up with something, they wouldn't have said that. You're playing your horn. You're blowing the spit out of the valve, even if you say, well, boy, my chops are gone. I hadn't played trombone in 20 years. You got the damn thing in your hand and they're blowing spit out of it and they're playing with the valve. That's when you say, well, I don't know what I'm doing. As long as you're talking. Remember. Well, now I can't sing. Well, at one time I had a pretty good voice. Well, that was before the accident. The accident being that I accidentally heard somebody could sing, and so. Somebody can say, no, I cannot sing. And everybody says, yes, he can sing, yes, he can sing. He used to be in the local amateur opera company. And so there you're on the stage or staying around the banquet hall. Now, come on, we got somebody to play a little piano. Help him out. And you say, well, all right. All right, so I did used to sing. And so then you can go into this, as you should know. It's not psychological. It is still energy being transferred. It is the exchange going on a different level than people think it's going on. But a person then, instead of having to do something, the more you can talk about it, the less you have to do, because then the person could explain why they can't sing, why it's been so long, and that they in fact have had throat trouble in the last 10 years, that right now they have a cold. They can go on and on with that, maybe take 5 or 10 minutes, not just blanketly say, oh, no, I'm not going to sing. Everybody says, we know you used to sing, we'd love to hear something. Come on. And so you could stand there and talk for 4 or 5 minutes, whatever it takes, until it would appear that the people lose interest. Whether they do it overtly or not, it's like the crowd then goes, oh, never mind, they just drift off. But it's still as though you performed. Somebody might later say, well, it's a shame he didn't sing. I've never heard him, but I used to hear that he was good. Yeah, he was. And that's the extent. They all forget. But you were nice. Your performance was explaining why you couldn't perform. All right. Don't lose your place. A real revolutionist is not going to fill in the space provided, because there is a space provided behind everything that the human intellect thinks. There is no such dance in the human intellect as the one step. The bare minimum is the two step. There is no such thing as a one-legged thought. The point of that being, if life is already wired up for a question to go through a man's intellect that says, what is the meaning of life? Even if you say, wait a minute, that's too heavy for me, I could never figure that out. You have filled in the damn blank. Life does not send out these questions that actually have a definitive, a serious piece of punctuation ending the sentence. That is the question. Which a question mark, as far as I remember, 3rd grade English or whatever it was, the question mark is a sure sign that that sentence is over. That whatever the inquiry was made, and there's a question mark there, and now the ball's in your court. That's the end of that sentence. That is the end of that energy burst. But it is not. Life does not send those out. Life does not send out even a statement with a question, with a period, exclamation point. That is never the end of it. There's always an unseen comma after that, and then a fill in the blank. Because the question, the first thought is the one step. But you can't dance the one step. I mean, 3-dimensionally, spatially. You can figure that. There's no such dance as the one step. If there was, if you tried it, all you're going to do is fall over. Now you can join Humpty Dumpty. That is not a dance. The minimum for a dance is the 2-step. Every question that life asks, that is, every piece of energy wired up in the human nervous system that comes out as a question, has a place, fill in the blank. That is, you are going to respond. It sounds like a question. In ordinary, at least civilized circumstance, you could say that an inquiry to another civilized human is optional. Like you ask somebody, how old are you? Of course, that's pretty uncivil, I guess, but where do you live? Or where did you go to school? Another person might say, well, I'd prefer not to answer. Or, how much do you make a year? It seems to be optional that you ask somebody something, that they can respond or not respond. It is not an option. you're going to fill in a blank of some kind, even if it's simply saying, hey, I don't know. You cannot be dealing with the course of inquiry that I was suggesting verbally that would be better put as not what is the meaning of life, but how is the meaning of life. The absolutely, truly, I'll cover it all, uninterested and disinterested feel toward what is the meaning of life. I shouldn't have said disinterested. Maybe you people that have dictionaries. It would truly be objective. It would be a clinical, I don't care. Don't care. All I want to do is pursue this. But as long as you find a place where you begin to care, you are very inclined, may I be sardonic for a second, to stop there, and in spite of what I told you, to stop there and do the one step. Because what you think is, well, now I got this. I got this as long as I can keep jumping on one foot and keep my balance, which, as all activities in the three-dimensional world, such an activity is finite. Okay. That is, I do not care if you are under the sway of terpsichore, you're going to trip, you're going to fall over eventually. That is, within a matter of seconds. You cannot do a one step. You cannot stop along and actually fill in to your satisfaction the provided blank to any question, or to fill in the provided blank for a response to any statement. How life works, or how the question, how is the meaning of life, if it has an answer, if it has a verbal answer, then you've stopped. You are attempting to do a one-step. You are back engaged in a minimal, a childish inquiry. You are back actually asking what is the purpose of life on the basis that your form of intelligence at that moment is capable of recognizing, either being able to see itself or recognize when it's pointed out to it, the purposes that life has for man. Which if that will satisfy you, you don't need to be anywhere as exotic as here. Just run immediately to the nearest church. Or, if that's too much trouble, get out of here, run outside, sit in your car, and check with your own self. Huh. May not be the voice of God, but it's the voice of reason, your conscience, common sense. Well, let's see if we can pick up, or I can plug some of us back in where we were the last time we were taping. About such matters as talk being a kind of defense for the growing intellect, and things perhaps being not as they are, being exemplary of a better, if not ideal, state, and people talking more about something and then having to do less in a more expanded version that may sound. It's not an attack, frontal attack on humanity that people talk too much and do too little. It's not that. That is an attack. But what I was trying to sketch up for you is that the talking about something is a part of a doing of something. But what appears to be simply the talking of something, the presentation, even the thinking of something, the more you know, the more you do it, the less you have to do from another view in life that would appear to be action without the necessity of a constant running monologue or commentary on what you're doing. Along those lines, I was going to, since the first part I thought was pretty simple and obvious tonight, I was going to at least take a chance and jump out for just a second to the kind of areas that everyone really enjoys. The difference between, again, nouns and verbs, actors and action. What is it that separates? We're not, of course, studying English here, which I guess should be obvious from listening to me talk. More better. there is a piece of the operations of energy through man that makes it necessary that man talk. For man talk, there has to be a kind of sets of laws that apparently have to do with rhetoric, grammar, but they actually have to do simply with the same kinds of physical phenomenon that the laws of physics cover. But it comes out as such things as nouns and verbs. That's the two most important parts in speaking any language. Things, goods, and services. Acts and actors. Why? Why is it necessary that energy be split up in such a way? Why is it that for the intellect to apparently be able to make any sort of sense out of what's going on out here? Perhaps not to conclusively understand it from the ordinary view, but to even start to be able to entertain questions like, what is the meaning of life? You cannot have a sentence unless it's got nouns and verbs. Not a sentence that's going anywhere other than yes, no, and there. But a sentence that would seem to be a byway, if not a nexus, to continued inquiry in thought. A pregnant sentence. It has to have nouns and verbs, or in the singular. What, from one view, we're not going to stop there, that's not the question really, but what I was going to say in response to my question of why do we have it, what if I pointed out to you that the difference, the operational difference between nouns and verbs is distance, a separateness. I don't think it's too obvious yet, but it has to convey a spatial, it would appear from the simplest view, distance. If we had a noun, if we had an actor, man, and we had an action, running, an out-and-out verb, even without having my degree in English, I believe I can truthfully say that running is an out-and-out verb. Oh, I know it could be a noun, never mind, but we got the noun and we got the verb. We've got the act and we've got the actor. But they must be separate. But now what do you have once you have a man running? Once the action and the man are one, the distance. Not verbally, because to say, I saw the man running, the sentence still makes sense. The sentence still is composed, amongst other things, but still contains a noun and a verb. But how about in reality, in the spatial movements of life, when the two are merged? Is there a difference then between that and the initial difference that causes the intellect to have to distinguish spatially between things and actions, between goods and services, acts and actors, nouns and verbs? I'm glad I beat my head before I started it. What is the difference between me bringing this up and the act of a man running, where the two things, the noun and the verb, the act and the actor, are merged? I guess one reasonable immediate response from an ordinary level is none. Or I don't understand. Talk could not operate as it does, in part, as I've been suggesting to you, as a defense to the intellect. It could not be operating as a continuing preparation for even additional talk. Without, amongst other things, but without, very specifically, it have the capability of doing this. Creating distance. But now it's not simply spatial distance. But talk creates distance. Talk keeps all secondary affairs from running together. And if they all ran together, they would be back to being primary affairs. Because one way to see what secondary affairs are, I'll revert back to a better known, instead of all my own, a commonly recognized theoretical picture now of creation, like the Big Bang, everything going apart, and everything starting out as one and becoming more complex. General theories in the life sciences even, mostly held, of being the spread of life forms evolution. There is a continuing difference spatially. And the more so, the more you have the people involved, the creatures involved, in this case men on this planet, the more they are becoming involved and driven by secondary activities. If indeed the distance, that wasn't that weird. Well, yeah, it was. Nobody ever heard it before on this planet. Things becoming sophisticated, just in the ordinary sense of sophistication. The difference between living, assuming you're the type that could feel the difference. The difference between living in New York and Manhattan and living in Snail's Head, Tennessee, if we agreed right quick that yes, in the ordinary sense, Manhattan is more sophisticated. Part of that sophistication, part of the energetic basis of it, is things are more separated. Now, I know that the density of the population is better, even I know that, than it is, let's assume, in Snail's Head, Tennessee. But the secondary activities of man are further removed. Well, come on, if you're going to keep coming here, you know by now you got to understand stuff logic. All right, if there was the cultural life of Snail's Head, Tennessee, let's say the cultural life of Snail's Head, Tennessee amounts to once a year they have Old Revenuers Day, or Old Moonshiners Day, I guess they'd have. Is that once a year they all get together, and those who have any talent bring their kazoos and fiddles, and they have a few drinks in honor of the moonshiners who are dead and gone. And once a year they get a shipment in of new calendars from Napa. Behind those forms I made up, the energy is this. You surely hear, if there's a cultural life, which is not the alpha and omega of what I'm describing, is not the example, but a cultural life, let's assume, it'd be easy to assume that the cultural life of Snail's Head could revolve around one, or maybe two, but let's just say a very small area, maybe one or two little holidays or occurrences or get-together a year. Whereas, to take that same sort of whatever cultural affairs mean to you, cultural life, in Manhattan, on one block, would be more possibilities, more things culturally going on in one night on one block than happens in Snail's Head all year round. So the people may be more densely packed, but the things are coming apart. That is, there is a greater plurality. There has to be. That is evolution. That is, even in the ordinary mechanical sense, that is 3D sophistication. Separation. There must be separation, or else what is now, I'll use cultural affairs again, cultural life as an example of secondary affairs. If things were not increasing in their separation, then we would assume if the laws of gravity, inertia, are still holding true, they would begin to fall back on themselves. If there were not a distance, life in the ordinary three-dimensional sense would not be expanding in secondary affairs, which is all we're talking about right now. We're not talking about the primary affairs of men becoming physically larger, stronger, hornier, meaner, hairier. It doesn't matter. The more you are involved in secondary affairs, the less there is of any consequence whether you're stronger, whether you can resist the elements anymore. You don't have to resist the elements anymore, not as long as you're involved enough in secondary affairs to have the bread to put yourself in a nice condo somewhere. Don't worry about the bills. the Con Ed bills, keep on the air conditioning year-round, or etc. You are protected. So we are talking about an expansion. We're talking about a growing complexity in secondary affairs, which is what this is, relatively speaking, for the sake of my arbitrary, ephemeral sketches on these nights. For the secondary affairs to continue to grow, right at the heart of it is a distancing, is a separateness. Is one reason it comes out, a little sidebar right quick, that it comes out more and more that philosophers, thinkers, novelists continue to write about the kind of alienation people feel. And there is a validity to it, modern men. And they point out that, of course, ordinary people cannot see causes and effects any more than they can see the need for a shark to have a radiator. But they will point out where the family is breaking down. People are no longer, it's not the large family. It's not like it is out in these nice tribal areas where people are still less sophisticated, so to speak, but they're there living with their own children. They let their grandparents come in, move into huts. They all protect each other. And here everybody's from divorced families nowadays, and your family, even your divorced parents, moved off to Arizona to become professional bowlers. And you grew up by yourself. That there is an alienation. The more you live in cities, the less thing there is that you even know your neighbors, much less care what the hell happens to them. So they pointed out that way. It's wrong. Well, it's wrong if you're going to see what's going on, because that is not a cause, that is not an effect. It is that there has to be a separateness, but it is not at the basis that there is something terribly wrong with the human condition, and that we have all, or large groups of people, by moving to cities and becoming educated or sophisticated, are now trotting the path of self-destruction, self-delusion, and alienating themselves. But there is a feeling of alienation, but the basis of it, I'm telling you, is at the energy level that things are expanding, and there is a reality. I'm not saying that you should feel it, that there's anything admirable about it, but the feeling that I am less connected, that some of you may have had, that maybe you read about, or maybe you felt in your lifetime, that I feel less connected to my parents, or my children, or my brothers or sisters, or my tribe, my family, my religion. I seem to feel less of it than my parents did. I seem to feel less of it than I read that other intelligent people that are my peers say that you should feel. It's expanding in all possible directions, and that kind of old-time feeling is gradually, it's not being lost, it's not right or wrong, it's not going anywhere, but as always, it is changing. That's why life is alive. It is inconsistent. The more things separate, the more secondary affairs from one view can grow, and the more things are subject to being compared. Because you cannot compare. If you had a stick of butter, you got one stick of butter. Now you're going to have to trust me. We're playing, as always, in Medea's Rays. We just got to jump in the middle of the story, and here it is, you got a stick of butter. Don't ask me where it came from or why we don't have some bread. A stick of butter. You can't do anything with a stick of butter until you can compare it. You can't do anything with a stick of butter until you cut into it. In a sense, a stick of butter, that perhaps is not the best example I could have made, because that touches on food, which gets close to, of course, primary areas. But things cannot exist specifically when you get into the secondary area. You cannot talk about anything without being able to compare it. In other words, you cannot talk about goodness. There is no such thing as goodness, comma, until what? Well, at least until it's cut. You know, to take the Judaic Christian myth, there could be no Lucifer, there could be no evil until we had a Lucifer. And the original story was, him and God was like that. They were one stick of butter. You had to separate it. You could not have goodness until somebody went, hey, wait a minute. I just saw something, and I'd never seen it before, and I never heard of it, but I know what it is. It's badness. Then, immediately, everybody said, that's a fact, Jack, because this is goodness. Now you got it. Now you can think. Now you can think. Now you can talk. Now you can pursue the question, what's the meaning of life? But there has to be a distance. You have to be able to cut, whether it be butter which I admit one more time, touching on primary aspects, don't let that trip you. But cutting up anything, morality, it has got to be cut. You have got to cut a stick of morality somewhere, and there has to be a distance. It may just be a little, but there's got to be a distance. It has to be comparable, or you cannot think about it. You certainly cannot talk about it. It has no operational validity in the 3D world, in the human nervous system. You could see, in a certain way, as talk being, if I may coin a new phrase, the great distancer, if there is such a word. There is now. That talk is it. Because spatial, if we're down to really closer to non-verbal primary areas, the distance between things, like an absolute stick of butter. If it was cut in two pieces, and let's assume you couldn't eat butter unless it was put back together in some way, then of course it is physically possible for anybody of almost any kind of intelligence to take the two pieces of butter and put them back together, to close the distance, to simplify that which was needlessly made complex at the primary level. But at the secondary level, it is, in a sense, the opposite direction, an opposite approach. Things must be separated. Now, some of you looking, you could not be an individual. If there were people still on this planet, which there are down in, I told some of you to check around your pelvic area, but if there were other individuals out there on this planet with no intellect going, they would have no sense of separation, plus they could not talk for other things. There would be no feeling in them of any self-alienation. If you told them to speak and you tried to start speaking about Camus or someone, about the alienation of modern man, and if you told them to speak right quick, they'd still go, huh? Because there would be no feeling of inner separation. Of course, I'm lying to you now, because if you told them to speak, you'd already started cutting them up. But it is only in the secondary affairs that things of necessity to be operational must be separate. They must be separate enough to be compared. And what, at the secondary level, at the sophisticated, the ordinary level of life, what is the great distancer? Not just a trombone, that'll keep you out of the way. Not just somebody with a bad singer, or not just somebody who has a lecture on the British Romantic poets, which will keep many people as far away as a bad trombone player. What is generally the great distancer? Talk. Talk is what, at the secondary level, separates you and me, you and the person next to you. Internally, when you get good, what separates you from you? What is the basis of any feeling of, well, I'm sophisticated and intellectual? And I'm talking about really sophisticated, because I feel personally a sense of internal, personal self-alienation. If you couldn't talk, you couldn't be alienated. Don't just say you couldn't say you were alienated. Well, that's obvious. Even I can see that. It's not that, well, if I couldn't talk, I couldn't say it. If you couldn't talk, you couldn't be it. Good night. And for those on audio tape, it's too late to say good night. And so consider I said good night before now, since the tape ran out.